Hello, I'm Paul Orselli, and I'm happy to be joined today by Blake Wigdahl. How are you, Blake?
I'm fantastic. Nice to be here.
Wow, fantastic. We're both fantastic.
Well,
Um,
I'm living the dream. And today
okay,
is
well
no different.
that bodes well for the conversation ahead. So without further ado, so Blake, what's just one thing about exhibits you would like to share with people today?
So, so, having been doing this a long time, and the question threw me, and I've been down the road, kind of thinking about all the things that could be great, and I went back to, I'm just going to go back to the thing I learned the first day I discovered that I kind of wanted, or I thought I might want to go into museums, and it's carried with me and been more formalized, and that is listen. And the most importantly around that, listen with both your eyes and your ears as it relates to exhibits. And so listening in terms of really observing, interacting, and understanding what's going on daily in the museum floor. And so when I was an undergraduate, my undergraduate was in archaeology and anthropology, and I really was enjoying undergraduate, not from an academic standpoint, but at some point I realized I probably should figure out what and where I wanted to go after grad school. And I asked my fellow students, and they're like, "Oh," I'm like, "So what are you going to do?" And one of them was like, "Oh, I did an internship up at the museum on campus." And I said, "There's a museum on campus?"
Oh, well, well, that's too bad you said that, but
and I was like, "Oh, maybe I should check that out." And I called up the director of education, Dr. Bonnie Sachatel Sawyer, and I said, I don't really need college credit. I don't need anything, but I'd just love to come up and help and intern and do whatever. And she's been was my first and greatest sort of entry into museums, and taught me so much right out of the gate. And I just fell in love, and she kind of kept me going. And that was literally the spark that got me into it. But what I thought was interesting, and going back to listening, is if this is a model of that museum, so a square box, 2 levels. There's a square box, 2 levels. The visitors and the parking lot, they came in on the top level, and they went in and out that way. And the staff, they could go in the back basement door and go in and out that way. And never at one point did they need to intersect in the space. And the museum, you could go up, and so it was on the second floor. And one of the things that I learned really right out of the gate is a lot of staff, not intentionally, I don't think, but just because of the nature of where they were going, would go in, do their job, and leave. And I was always going up into the floor. And so it was that what I realized of like what's really happening on the floor, and then how does that translate into what you create, whether it's in education or in exhibits, because I've spent my time in both probably fairly equally. And that you can use some really, really simple tools. There's a lot of great evaluation that takes place in our field and other ways of kind of understanding and learning, but the simple tools of just using your eyes and your ears. And that was the sort of thing that I first started doing, and I kind of walked around. And so I think the problem of listening is both a staff one as well as a visitor one. And so on the staff side of things, it's the problem boils down to you're not really knowing because you're in your office, or you're not out there enough, or you just start assuming. I've been out there a lot. I was there early on my career or wherever, or like doing now where I'm not working inside a museum, not having daily access to the floor or whatnot. I could just start assuming, and so I have to continually inject. Like I'm taking my whole team to a museum we're working with, and we're spending time on the floor next week, and we do that on a regular basis just because we can't assume. So I think on the staff side of things, we sometimes design, like when I worked at the Exportorium, my office was literally across the highway from the museum floor in the old Palace of Fine Arts. And so so I think it's sort of both on that side. And then I also think it's on the visitor side in terms of listening and observing. Preferences change, our communities change. As we work in the museum field and we go from one community to the other, things are very different. I like remember working and using the museum stool in one community in part of the world where it was like, oh, that's the kind of thing you use. And then coming to Utah where families are bigger and they don't pay attention to all their kids, and that little kids couldn't use those things because they would tip them over. And it's such, you just can't take for granted. And so I think listening is like one of those top kinds of moments.
So I'm I love that you called out Bonnie, just to continually prove what a small world the museum is. I know Bonnie too. Hi, Bonnie. So
Yeah.
but I like the little visual aid that you showed too, which is actually really apropos to your just one thing about listening, and this notion that a lot of times people who work in museums, like they can spend their entire days, if not seemingly their entire careers, without ever venturing onto the museum floor and having an authentic interaction with visitors. So what are some tips? And you sort of mentioned one, perhaps, like talking about bringing your team to the museum that you're going to be working with. But I'm just curious, like, what are tips that can help people become better listeners with both their eyes and their ears, but to break down those sort of back of house, front of house dichotomies that happen, because that is not just a visitors and staff thing. Sometimes that's a staff thing, like people who are front of house or people who are back of house, whatever that means. So I'd just be curious what your thoughts are, or what kind of tips you have in that regard.
So it's a nice lead in. So that first museum, right? That was, I didn't formalize it, but I started to see it, and you would hear it in like meetings. It would be like, well, these people are going to come from here. You know, the curator would tell me this is how it's going to work. I'm like, that's not at all how it works up there. You should go up there. And so like, it was very informal, and I started to formalize it. And it's a nice lead into sort of my next museum. I ended up at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and I was just telling you, my office was across the street, and so it started formalizing for me, and then I formalized it with staff, that my teams and stuff like that. But it started as what I still call my orange cream soda moment. And so the formalized mode of that tool is in everybody's day we need to take a break. And at the Exploratorium, the cafe was at the back of the old Palace of Fine Arts, and so I would intentionally I would go get out of my desk. I would go through the museum slowly, buy an orange cream soda, and take the amount of time it took to drink an orange cream soda, to walk through, watch, observe, and interact with guests and see what was really going on. So I think it's as simple as like taking a break and just going and making an intentional part of one's day, one's week.
Yeah, not just taking the break, but making it an intentional part of your day, that you're going to do this on a repeated basis. So it's not just like, oh yeah, I go on the museum floor all the time. Meanwhile, like, you know, maybe you were last there 3 months ago, you know?
Yeah. And so formalizing that in whatever way works in your schedule, putting it in there. You know, if you think about, we all work, there are those peak moments in our days. Like I work better in the morning and the afternoon. So the afternoon is a perfect time for me to just say, this is when it happens. And I do that. And then the whole idea about the orange cream soda is it doesn't have to be all day. It doesn't have to be a long period of time. It can be as long as it takes to drink a soda or whatnot, or coffee or whatever, and those sorts of things. So I think that like intentionality of it is one tool. The other one is when then I left the Exploratorium, they did, and I went to a new institution that didn't have orange cream soda, or and it had multiple museums in multiple locations of which we had to observe in. But I also started getting more team members and started training people that worked with me on my team, my exhibits and the design and education. And that wasn't enough to get like a staff person to go, oh, okay, I see that, you know, my boss wants me to do these sorts of things. And so I started to formalize the very sophisticated tool. So I've had this for many years, and many of the smart people in museums that I've worked with through time, they always seem to carry around a nice book, a pencil and paper, anybody that knows me, I got a lot more that could go along with that as a tool. But what I started to do and what I do is the formal tool of this. On one sheet of paper, draw an eye and write C, and on the other side, draw an ear and write here. And go out on the floor and fill this page and write down what you see and at the same time what you're hearing. And one of the things, the intentionality of that was, as I learned, is like, it's one thing, and that you see this with like prototyping, right? Are you really prototyping or are you facilitating? When you're testing something on the floor, are you out there and showing people how to do it? And then that's not really prototyping. That's letting people, facilitating. And so the same thing, I think, in observation is, am I really taking simple notes? And again, these are for our own purposes of what people are actually saying. And then what do I see? And then come back and, on the back sheet, do the reflections or whatnot. And the writing of it down. And again, this is not like rigorous evaluation for reports. This is just about, and that's why I say it's nice to have it in your own book, is that you can go back to that at any time or whatnot and sort of keep those and stuff through time, because then you can start to see from that listening from a visitor perspective, preferences change. I noticed this, can you pull that out while you're you're designing or prototyping an exhibit or coming up with ideas, those kinds of things. You have something you can kind of pull from. And the other part to that is oftentimes I see something very different than what they're actually saying.
Yeah.
And so when I'm writing down what they're saying. I'm not interpreting, oh, they're, doing this or sorts of things, because it's those questions to me that I think are the most important. I talk a lot about my team is listen, wonder, then create. So let's listen to and understand the community first. Let's understand what's going on. That'll lead to questions that we can explore in our own curiosity. And then we can start to come up with things that make that. And so that connection with the writing down of what people are actually, what questions they're having, where are the problems, and so many discoveries have come from that. So like, we all know that people don't read graphics as much as we'd like them to in museums, but they read them more at the beginning of an experience than they do at the end of an experience. And then, especially in like a natural history museum or whatnot, people really kind of want to know the content. And so many natural history museums are along the geologic timeline, so everybody knows a lot before dinosaurs and not a lot after dinosaurs, because they get worn out. And so like even that simple one, I've worked in 2 museums that are on that designed in that timeline of 4.5, as like, well, can we just shift the entrance every so often? So you start at the beginning and as opposed to the Big Bang or whatnot. And what does that do for the, and so it's like, that's not
sure.
And so I think those are the big ones. And then, the kind of the last thing is just never stop doing it. No matter how good we get at these sorts of things. And then to kind of go back to what I mentioned Bonnie, and she was writing this book, and I read it in a 3-ring binder when she was writing this book. It was about adult museum programs and designing meaningful experience and what transformative learning is. That like kind of set the tone. But that same sort of like me trying to figure out another book, American Innovators, Museum Innovators.
Yeah, sure.
And that's where I was in Montana, and I discovered Frank Oppenheimer. And I think this connects to listening to. I've carried this quote since the first days I started working. A museum should not be a substitute for a school or a classroom, but it should be a place where people come both to teach and to learn. Visitors should be able to find it refreshing and stimulating. Above all, it should be honest and convey the understanding that science and technology have a role which is deeply rooted in human values and aspirations. And to me, that it should be a place for both to teach and to learn. That goes back to, this isn't just about staff creating and sharing, and it isn't just about visitors coming in, that you are both at all times. And that if you're listening and doing both of those things, you're going to be far more engaged and create far more meaningful experiences for people.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to end. Although I will say one other thing, since you held up Bonnie's book and you mentioned another book, we will, of course, since this will end up on YouTube, as they say, there will be descriptions and links, including to Blake's business, below in the YouTube description. So I'd like to thank you, Blake. This media is perfect to highlight both the eyes and the ears when you talked about listening. So, hey,
Right.
perfect. Well, thanks again so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is great.
Take care.